This is a production of Cornell University.
It's good. Thank you, Leah, for the introduction, and thank you all for having me today. I'm really excited to be here and get to talk about some of my own research. Obviously, I do human dimensions of agriculture. I actually started as an environmental scientist in my undergrad, and then got kind of pulled into the social science side because I realized I was really interested in why people were doing what they were doing related to the environment. And that kind of developed into why people are doing what they're doing in agriculture specifically. And so that's really what this presentation is going to be about, and integrating that social science perspective into agricultural research. So I'm going to talk about pesticide-resistant social collapse and strategies for community management approaches. And this grew out of my dissertation research that I still continue today, working with a lot of weed scientists. So I'll introduce you a little bit to pesticide resistance. I'm sure a lot of you know what this is. When I give this talk to sociologists, this is a bit of a longer slide. But so the inherited ability of a pest to survive and reproduce following exposure to a dose of pesticide that's normally lethal. I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with this issue. And that issue has been growing, especially with the use of glyphosate. So this was estimated agricultural use for glyphosate in 1995, with the darker areas being more use per square mile. And this is the estimated use in 2019. And so basically, if you use one herbicide over and over and over and over again, the plant is going to evolve resistance to that herbicide. And suddenly you are spraying Roundup and you can't actually kill anything. So this has been a trend that continues to today. So this is the number of glyphosate-resistant species starting at about 1996 and going up through 2020. So you can see there's been a massive increase in the number of weed species that are resistant to glyphosate. And so one of the common answers is, well, okay, so it's resistant to glyphosate, we'll just use another herbicide, right? Issue with that is you get multiple resistances. Things can be resistant to more than just one chemical. And so we see this increase specifically in weeds resistant to 2, 3, 4 more kinds of herbicides. So it's not really an issue that can just be solved by chemical management. And this is really what the weed scientists I was working with were discovering back during my dissertation, is they had tried to say, hey, we know that integrated weed management works and rotating chemicals works, but nobody's actually doing it. So maybe it's more than just a weed science problem. Maybe it's more than just a chemistry problem. So some of the reasons why resistance is an issue: higher weed management costs. For instance, Palmer amaranth that's herbicide resistant in cotton in Georgia was shown to increase management costs on the farm by 58%. So this is a really big concern for farmers economically, a lot of motivation to deal with that. Also, lower crop yields can be a problem. Increased tillage is one that's come up recently, where maybe you're going back to tillage to control your weeds. And that's a big problem for soil conservation. When I was out at University of Idaho in the Pacific Northwest doing some of this work, this was a really big deal. Lots of highly erodible land out there and a lot of soil conservation efforts. So the increased tillage was a big issue. There's also potentially a return to more volatile herbicides. So if glyphosate isn't working, maybe we go back to some old chemistries. And some chemistries have actually been released by the EPA that were previously not allowed. And now people in Georgia can actually use those. And I've also been in focus groups where people tell me some of the herbicides they're using, and the weed scientists who are with me are like, that's illegal. I'm like, okay, wow, they are really using whatever it is they have at hand. Another problem that comes up is societal unrest. Because obviously, if you're having this problem and farmers are already under a lot of stress just trying to survive, then this is going to put you in competition with other farmers, and there's all sorts of kind of community issues that I'll get into in a little bit, and specifically the murder of farmer Mike Wallace in Arkansas, which I will go into specifically, and that was a result of dicamba drift. So we see a lot of kind of community collapse around this issue as well. So there's a variety of ways that weed scientists say we should address herbicide resistance. And so this is from a seminal article by Jason Norsworthy, who I worked with, and he lists all of these various best management practices for dealing with herbicide resistance. And so I'm just going to go through these really quick, but it's things like understanding the biology of the weed, using a diversified approach, maintaining weed-free fields, plant weed-free crop seeds, scout fields, multiple modes of action, labeled herbicide rates, cultural management, integrated and biological management, prevention of weed seed movement, and management of weed seeds at harvest, and then finally management of field borders. So they have all these best management practices, and they come to the sociologists and say, why aren't they doing this? And I'm like, wow, that is a lot right there, right? That is a lot to expect farmers to do all at once. And they say, but we know that if they do this, they will manage it. They'll have these economic benefits, it'll have these social benefits. And we've been going out there, we've been doing this outreach, and people aren't doing it. And they really wanted us to go out and find out, why aren't farmers listening to us? And that actually wasn't the message that we got. So I was hired to do some research on this, and I'm going to talk about my research spanning from my dissertation work, which is from like 2014 to 2017, and then I'll actually talk about a bit of my work out at Washington State and at Iowa State University. But in general, my research methodology spans qualitative and quantitative research. The qualitative part, I've done focus groups, interviews, community meetings, listening sessions, content analysis, pretty much everything that you can think of in qualitative work. And that was mostly to say, what even is the issue? We don't know how farmers are thinking about this. So first, let's go out and ask them and do some exploratory work. And then I've also done some quantitative work, primarily surveys, testing the kind of themes that I found from the qualitative research. And so what I was doing for my first project was really trying to understand just the social context of herbicide resistance. And what I was getting to was that farmers absolutely knew what herbicide resistance was. They understood it. They understood how it happened. That was not a mystery to them, right? And these weed scientists were just like, they're just not educated enough. I'm like, no, they definitely are. Like, they know what's going on here. And furthermore, they want to do it. Pretty much all the farmers I talked to were like, ideally, yes, I would be doing integrated weed management. But there are things that are stopping me from achieving that. And there were things like the size of the farm, the structure of the farm, economies of scale, really all of these structural barriers that farmers had that they were like, I can't go out and scout my field for weeds every single day and hand hoe them. My farm is too big, and it has to be that big for me to survive as a farmer. There are also various kind of ideologies that people held around this. And so as a sociologist, that's more of what I focused on. So I'm going to introduce you to two of those today. And the first one was this techno optimism that farmers had. And the second was individualism. So these were really kind of ways that farmers saw the world that were preventing them from using more integrated practices. So techno-optimism was essentially the belief that a new miracle herbicide was going to be developed and come out and kind of save everything, where we don't have to worry about herbicide resistance because the next one's going to come out. We're going to get the next glyphosate, we're going to get the next Roundup, and then we won't have to worry about it. And then that's going to happen again after that other one, and then again after that other one. And this has kind of happened in the past, which is part of why they believe this. But a new herbicide mode of action hasn't come out in like 30, 40 years, something like that. So it's not happening quickly. And then individualism is basically this belief in the sanctity of autonomy and agency. We're a very individualistic culture in the US, and farmers in particular are very much like, I make my decision on my farm, and nobody else can tell me how to do that. And then therefore, I cannot tell my neighbor how to farm either. This is a problem when you have weeds that are moving between people's farms, when you have resistant insects that are moving between people's farms. You have to collaborate in order to manage a landscape scale issue effectively, but farmers are really stuck in that I manage my land and nobody else does. So I'll give you a couple examples of quotes from my focus groups and meetings. So techno-optimism, I had people saying, I think we're all hoping probably there's somewhere in that chemistry, there's something that comes around that's a new version, stall long enough, maybe they'll figure something out, give us another product, that's about it. So when I asked, how do you solve herbicide resistance? This was the answer. Also had, you can't tell me that it can't be done, you can't tell me that there ain't a chemical out there to kill that weed, I will never believe it. And in other words, trying to keep a company keeping new products moving in the pipeline, because that's what's going to have to happen eventually. This is never going to go away. You're always going to have an issue with whatever herbicide comes out. And I was like, yes, you're on the right track. And then, so keeping new options coming is more important than really the agricultural practices and all that. Then Roundup definitely allowed people to get bigger because it worked so good for so long that you could double your acres easily and get the work done. But I don't see the cultivator coming back. And then everyone laughed. I think we're going to have to find chemicals. So we're not going to till, the farm's too big, we have to find chemicals. And then the silver bullet talk came up a lot. We get a silver bullet and everyone loads their gun up with the silver bullet and just empties it. Well, by then everything starts getting resistant to it, we've got to find another bullet. Well, now we're looking for gold bullets, not silver bullets. So there is a lot of this rhetoric, right, around the hope for a new silver bullet, the new thing that is going to save us so that we don't have to deal with these more complex management practices. And the weed scientists I was working with were very familiar with this idea. And we're like, yes, we're absolutely hearing that. But they were like, why are farmers hoping for this? We keep telling them it's not coming. And really interestingly, I think a lot of it had to do with fear. I think a lot of farmers knew that this option is not coming, but they also felt like they had no other choice. So in response to this first quote here, another grower said, that's the hope. I would say that might be all it is hope. And this really spoke to me because I think that the techno-optimism they were experiencing wasn't necessarily, I actually believe this is going to happen. It was, I don't see any other option. I don't see any other way out of this situation. So it was really this kind of fear that was driving techno-optimism. It was a fatalistic attitude. It was a loss of a sense of agency. That was like, I cannot manage this. My farm is too big. I can't talk to my neighbors about it. Like, what am I can't manage it by myself. So I have to rely on a herbicide. So I was driven by this lack of agency, farm size, and really seeing limited options for how they could manage weeds. And really interestingly, in my survey research, I did some statistical analysis and modeling, and we saw that people who had more of this techno-optimistic belief relied more strongly on a herbicide-based weed management strategy. So they were less likely to go with integrated weed management and more likely to go very herbicide-heavy. But really, this wasn't really an unquestioned faith based on lack of knowledge. That's what a lot of the weed scientists thought it was. But I don't think that's what was going on here. They really had a knowledge of their own powerlessness in this situation. And that was driving these feelings of dependency and these feelings of techno-optimism, that this new herbicide has to come out and save us. So, moving on to individualism. These are very tied together, as we'll soon see. But a couple quotes. So techno-optimism was one big theme that came out. Individualism was another. We had this great conversation in one of the groups where the first participant said, bite your tongue. I said, huh? It said, bite your tongue and wait. Harder, yeah, till it bleeds. So this was me asking, what would happen if your neighbor had herbicide resistance weeds on their farm? And this is what they said. They are not talking to each other about this. Another answer was, my answer would be nothing. I don't see myself going up and knocking on the door and saying, you need to get rid of your weeds. And I think that's probably going to be a typical answer. Economics have to run the show. And then I had some neighbors come up to me concerned about another neighbor in our area that has issues with spraying, but I mean, nobody did anything about it, but they're concerned. And if it's at the back end, maybe if it was a few plants, you could go out there and pull them by hand if they don't fire at you from the house or something. So really not a situation in which they felt they could go and talk to their neighbors about this. They did say if their neighbor came to them and asked for advice, they would be more than happy to give advice. But there is this culture of you cannot go and tell your neighbor what to do, even if that's going to come over and affect you, and it's going to get onto your farm. They said it'd be like telling your neighbor what color to paint their truck. You know, they had those kind of quotes. And for a long time, I didn't really understand this, but I also had an experience where I was living in Idaho, and I was raking leaves, and I hate raking leaves, and it's taking forever. And my neighbors across the street are not raking their leaves, and they have a ton of leaves, and they're blowing across the street into my yard. And I'm really pissed off, and it's taking me a bunch of time, and I'm not going over there and being like, hey, you need to rake your leaves. Like, that's part of the culture in the US, is it's very individualistic, and it was hard for them to have these confrontations. But there was also kind of a desire to do it in some ways, where one grower said, I do ask a lot of my friends, what did you use? What did you use? And then compare it to what I'm doing. And it would be nice to have a bigger bank of that knowledge. So at the same time that techno-optimism, people were starting to kind of doubt it and look for other options, individualism in much the same way, not everyone was super on board with. They maybe wanted that larger suite of information and wanted to be having more conversations. So for individualism, also in my survey, I looked at what lowered individualism, what made people more likely to collaborate. And one thing was how concerned they were about pesticide resistance. Was this a big issue for them? Another was the actual presence of the weeds in their own fields. So having the weed in your own field makes you more likely to want to collaborate with other people dealing with the same issue. The visibility of the issue and having direct experience was very important. And this was really interesting because high levels of concern, low levels of individualism led to more communication and collaboration with more neighbors. And that was statistically significant in predicting more integrated weed management practices. So when they were moving away from this individualism, when they were communicating and collaborating with their neighbors, they saw integrated weed management as more feasible. They're more likely to use that and less likely to rely on technologies and just on herbicides. So we're wondering if this is a possible path to integrated pest management. If we can direct this concern less into like a fatalism that leads to techno-optimism and more into, hey, you can work together to try and solve some of this problem. Now, unfortunately, we have seen potentially more community collapse than we have seen collaboration. So I have another quote here from one of my focus groups in Iowa. This was conducted in spring of 2016. And this was said in a joking manner, but fairly serious topic, where I asked, what would you do if your neighbor had herbicide resistance issues? And somebody said, just think, shoot the neighbor. Everyone laughed. Hoping he'll die soon. Oh yeah. And everyone was like cracking up, like, you know, very much a joke. But they were really getting to that point of like, you cannot talk to your neighbor. And then a couple months later in Arkansas, in October of 2016, Mike Wallace was murdered in a dicamba drift dispute. So the things that my farmers were talking about were very serious and had very serious consequences in this other context. So dicamba was like the new herbicide, right? It got deregulated, it got reformulated, you had dicamba-resistant soybeans, and it was like, it's not going to drift as much, this is going to help. And people were using it off-label, using it before it was approved, and it drifted into this guy's field, killed a bunch of his soybeans, and there was a murder over this. So we've seen a lot of social collapse, and it's like, okay, techno-optimism, the next technology, the next fix, dicamba, has actually furthered conflict and furthered extreme individualism, where you're looking out for yourself and you're not collaborating with your neighbors on this issue. And it's pushed producers kind of away from community management because it's pitting people against each other in terms of, I'm taking care of my own crop and you need to take care of your own crop. You need to plant dicamba-resistant soybeans. And some producers are becoming really disenchanted with this next technology. And if you see interviews in Arkansas around this time, like this was very impactful for people, right? This was very impactful. And people saying, we need to do something, we need to change. This culture is not working anymore. And so I had an Arkansas focus group farmer, this was in 2016 before the murders, but he was kind of doubting this silver bullet. And he said, well, they're not called the silver bullet, but anyway, the next option we have, you can tell nobody's happy with it. It's nothing to be happy about. We're all more or less wondering how bad it's going to be, not how good it's going to be. So people were doubting the silver bullet. They were doubting the techno-optimism. They were starting to see problems with this very individualistic kind of society approach. And we were wondering, is this an opportunity? So a lot of times opportunities in sociology we see as points of disintegration, as points where things are falling apart, right? Something, the pan is in the fire, it's like the fire's on your doorstep, you have to do something. So maybe some of this is a way to have an entry point into having discussions. And so what our team has proposed is using community as a way forward. And this has also happened in Arkansas. Arkansas is the center of a lot of these discussions because it has a lot of herbicide resistance problems. But Arkansas actually initiated their own community management program for herbicide-resistant Palmer amaranth. It was called the Zero Tolerance Program. It was voluntary. There was an extension educator who was involved, and a bunch of farmers who all got together and would say, we are not going to tolerate a single Palmer amaranth in our fields. And they put up signs being like, we're part of this program. And they reduced their weed seed bank from 2010 to 2012 significantly. So this really worked, getting people together. And it was almost like a peer pressure thing in some ways, but it was also a support group in some ways for these farmers of sharing the strategies that worked for them. There was a story of one farmer who was like dressed in his Sunday best, going to church with his family. He was driving along and saw a pigweed in somebody else's field, but they were part of this program and he knew them. And he was like, I'm getting that thing. And he got out of his truck and climbed through the ditch in his Sunday best and pulled out that pigweed, right? So there was kind of this community support aspect, and we're all in this together. It was making people feel a lot more empowered and really having positive outcomes in terms of integrated weed management and managing resistance. The problem is eventually the extension guy retired and the program fell apart. This is a trend that you will see again and again. So I did some work in Washington State with this, and we can talk about that later if it's of interest. But right now my focus is on the Iowa Pest Resistance Management Program, which was started before I got to Iowa State, but I have been involved in it. And it was essentially started after a statewide meeting in 2015 where people were like, we really need to address pesticide resistance and we need to do it collectively. We need to do it as a community. We can't just let farmers try and go it alone. We need support systems here. And so it was a community-based grassroots approach to getting pest management issues resolved in Iowa. And we have 4 pilot communities in Harrison County, Story County, Northeast Iowa, and Northwest Iowa. 2 of those are focused on herbicide resistance, and then we also have 1 on soybean aphid and 1 on corn rootworm. And those were kind of our challenge communities of like the issue isn't quite as big in those communities yet. So we're like, can we get ahead of it? Can we get people to act proactively? The answer more or less was no. But we gave it a shot, right? So some of the stuff that has come out of the Iowa Pest Resistance Management Program include us developing and refining a model for community change. So basically understanding the context of the community that you're in, doing more of a participatory framework, and understanding how that community works and what kind of resources they have, and how communities themselves can understand that and use that understanding to better manage their own resources. Our econ team also developed and is currently refining an economic analysis tool, which is kind of hard to see here, but basically they worked with one of our groups and got these baselines for what are the costs for your inputs every year. How much do you spend on this? How much do you spend on that? What are your costs for managing weeds? And then they had different types of management you could do, like band-aids, which are small fixes, or big structural changes like crop rotations. And then they forecasted out how much money that would save you. So that's one of the tools that we are currently working on developing further. And then we also have been working with NRCS to do conservation enhancement programs. So our statewide NRCS office has actually done this really cool integrated pest management conservation enhancement where you go through and check off all of these things that you've done. And some of them are social things. It's like going to community meetings, going to extension meetings, and those can get you points towards getting these payments for conservation enhancement. So that's something that we're really interested in as well. But part of the issue with this group and these 4 pilot communities has also been that a lot of them have kind of stagnated. So I came in halfway through a project on this, and I was on a grant, and I became the PI for the grant because the other one had retired. And the purpose of the grant was, let's understand why these communities have been so successful. And I got there and I was like, I don't know if they have. So I was like, I think maybe we need to change the direction of this grant question because I can't really explain why they've been successful because I don't think that they really have. Like some of them really started strong and did a lot of really good stuff, but then they kind of lost momentum, right? Just kind of like the Arkansas group did a lot of really great stuff, but then just kind of petered out. So like, what's going on here? What's happening here? And so my research question became, why are these communities stalling out? Why are they not working? What are the factors here that are limiting people? Because people were really passionate about this. It wasn't that there wasn't an issue. It wasn't that there wasn't passion. So what's going on here that's not enabling this? So I ended up doing a series of focus groups that were, why didn't this work? And so I went into the communities and said, why hasn't this group grown? Why has it stalled out? Why did this group not form in the first place? Even though there was a lot of excitement about managing pesticide resistance as a community, we never really got that off the ground. What happened? So I've started coding those focus groups, and basically we found 3 primary themes around why these community initiatives have kind of fallen apart in various ways. One of them is low investment from farmers, and that's not necessarily in the issue itself, but farmers are really busy, right? I'll get into an example of that in a minute. A second was limited willingness to accept alternative perspectives. So sometimes these groups got really insular, and it was just like, it's what we want to do. And you don't grow by doing that. And then another was just weak horizontal networks between farmers. So there wasn't a lot of farmer collaboration in general, and so it was really hard to collaborate on this specific issue. So I'll give some examples of this. So low investment from farmers. We had a farmer here saying that there's a lot of absentee people. So they're referring to landowners specifically. So low investment of landowners. And then the younger generation, I think, is more proactive on issues like this, but there's relatively few of them in agriculture. And that quote spoke to an issue that a lot of farmers brought up, which was that there aren't that many of us, right? Like, how can we collaborate when we have these massive farms and we live so far away from each other and the landowners aren't even here? So that was a big issue. And then also leadership was a big issue. So in one community, we had a great leader, but in this community, the guy who would kind of be the obvious leader told us this. He said, I don't want to be the leader of any group. I'll follow, but I don't want to be the leader. And it was, okay, is that more of a wait and see kind of approach? And he said, absolutely. I mean, I'll help. I'll throw out a field day. I'll call people. but a lot of people don't want to be the chief and would rather be led. So farmers have a lot on their plate. This guy was involved in all sorts of stuff. It was really hard to even get an interview with him because he was so busy. And so he didn't want to be the leader. There just wasn't that level of investment. As far as limited willingness to accept alternatives, this popped up specifically in one of our groups where there was a really strong leader in the group. Like, he really pushed that group forward and got a lot of stuff done. But they had this to say about him. So this is a pseudonym, so his name isn't actually Bill. But they said people like Bill and people dislike Bill. And he has an equal amount of enemies as he does friends, or probably more. But a big reason why we got so much accomplished is his leadership. But that's also what's holding us back. Then he said the same thing again. He's a polarizing figure, and he has opinions. So they got this good core group together with this guy as the leader, but then nobody else came in. And it was Bill's way or the highway, right? And so this guy said, it's hard to change what we're doing with the same people, in my opinion. So they'd have the same group of like 10 people for several years, and they just couldn't get anyone else involved. And this person who was really key to the movement didn't want to get anyone else involved. He wanted to do things his way. And to do an effective community management program, you have to have a variety of opinions and a more kind of equal governance structure. And then weak horizontal networks, this was fascinating to me as a social scientist in particular. But people said things, I asked them, what was the impact of COVID that made the group in part fall apart? And this person basically said, we lack interpersonal connection now. We meet on Zoom, but we don't get that connection. We don't get that bond. And they said the people that show up in person are the ones that are interested in something, and between them, they kind of form a bond. And so this was really talking about that bonding between growers that's maybe not happening as much, especially in this more digital age. And then we also had, again, somebody saying the number of farmers has just dwindled. And farming used to be a community, and now they don't necessarily want to come to a meeting where they're going to see the 500-acre farmer, and they just rented a farm out from underneath that 500-acre farmer. So a lot of this individualism and competition among farmers. But another really interesting thing that came up with this was farmers were telling me, we don't have a coffee shop to meet at anymore. We don't have as many farmers in our community. Not as many people are going to church. So it was actually in some ways a rural development issue of these shrinking rural communities that did not have the venues to create community. If you don't have community, it's going to be really hard to manage a resource as a community. So some of my takeaways from this entire presentation: farmers' resistance management practices are limited by a couple things. They're limited by techno optimism and individualism, and those are enacted in complex ways. And there's some indicators of fatalism and disenchantment with that techno optimism and individualism, where people are starting to see some real holes in these theories and feeling that, like, maybe I don't really believe this. Maybe I'm being forced to believe this, and I would really like to manage my weeds in a different way. And maybe this is an opportunity for change if people are feeling this way. So I would propose community-based management as a potential way to address these issues of techno-optimism, fatalism, and individualism, and give people a community of support, give them back some agency, and show them alternative practical ways to manage weeds. But this also appears to be challenged by things like low investment, limited acceptance of alternatives, and weak horizontal networks. So what might we do about that? That's kind of the position I'm in right now, right? I've gotten this far. Where do we go next? So I have a couple suggestions for ways forward. One of those is transdisciplinary collaboration. This is where a lot of this started, is with weed scientists reaching out to some social scientists and helping us understand the complex nature of this issue in more depth. So I'm currently working with a team on an NSF grant that is looking to basically model community capacity for management, but also look at, is the pest actually a landscape scale pest? Is it something we should be managing at the community level? And how do those two things intersect to see if the community actually has potential for managing this specific pest? So I think we need more collaboration among disciplines, but also more collaboration like with farmers and with crop advisors and with all these other actors who are playing a role in this problem. Polycentric governance, another big issue. So that basically means that you allow the community to self-govern, but you also have support from entities at a national, state, and local level. So a lot of communities would be very frustrated that, like, the EPA had blanket regulations across the US and that they weren't really relevant to local realities. Or same thing with NRCS. So there has to be some kind of contextual local involvement in government. And then also I think rural development is going to be really important. So if we want community collaboration, and we say like, okay, we're seeing these issues, community could help this, we need to develop those communities. We need to build stronger communities and more connected communities. So it becomes an issue, not just of agriculture, but also of rural development. So if you're particularly interested in that, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm always happy to talk about these kinds of things. And I have a variety of articles on this subject as well. So I have just a selection of those here that you might be able to look into if some of these topics piqued your interest and you want to learn more in depth. But I would be happy to take questions at this point. Thank you, everyone.
Have you found any difference between organic farmers and farmers that use pesticides between the, like if there's a weed on an organic farm, I assume it's not that big of a deal, but the neighbor might go.
Yeah. So the question was about differences between organic growers and people who are not organic. And so most of my knowledge from this comes from a couple focus groups I did in Iowa. In my national survey, I don't think we had like any respondents who are really organic. But in the focus groups, I had 2 focus groups that had 1 organic grower each. And this was really, really interesting because in one of the focus groups, it was like one of the worst focus groups I've ever done in my entire life. It was like pulling teeth. I got into there and one of the guys was like, "You're organic, huh?" The other guy was like, "Yeah." And they basically didn't talk for the rest of the time. It was just like me being like, "Please talk, please talk." They just like hated each other because the organic guy saw the other guy using pesticides as like killing his crops and like the problem. And then the conventional guy was like, "Well, you're the problem because you're letting weeds come onto the farm, right? And then they're spreading to my farm." And it was just really this headbutting kind of thing. But in the other focus group I did with an organic grower, right off the bat, the organic grower got ahead of it by being like, "I went organic for the price premium." And then everyone understood. And so they're much more willing to have that face-to-face conversation of, "Oh, I understand where you're coming from now." But there's definitely kind of more acceptance on organic farms of the presence of weeds, right? There's a different standard of good farming and what it means to be a good farmer. But it also takes a lot of like cognitive work to get to that point because there's such a perception that a good farm is a clean farm. And it's really hard for people to move away from that. So for organic growers, maybe a little easier to get to that point of it's okay to have some weeds. But for conventional growers, it has to be clean. And that means a lot of herbicides. And that can actually result in more resistance.
Do you think that, so I imagine a lot of these farmers are used to getting information on weed management from companies that are making products. Do you think that the techno optimism is, that message is coming from the companies? Do you think that's a big obstacle?
Yes, the long and the short of it. But it's also complex and changing. So initially, like Monsanto, when they released Roundup, they literally wrote a paper that said it will never become resistant. Like they wrote that paper and they put that out there. And I had growers telling me, I read that paper and I trusted it and they were really pissed, right? So there was that real like techno-optimistic narrative from companies, and companies are invested in being able to say, "We will give you the next solution," right? But some of the content analysis that I've done, and this isn't published for a variety of reasons, but basically I looked at websites for the major agrochemical companies and looked at them like 10 years back and to the present and how they talked about herbicide resistance. And I saw a real transition in a lot of these companies from being like herbicides, rotate your herbicides, to suddenly companies have a lot more pages on integrated weed management. And they have a lot more suggestions of how you can maintain the efficacy of their chemical, right? So there has been kind of this shift in company rhetoric towards more integrated management. And there's also division within companies. So I work with a lot of people at agrochemical companies who are in like research and development. They have a very different perspective than the people in marketing, right? So it's not as simple as just saying the companies want this. There's a lot of tension within the companies as far as what they're talking about as well. Yeah, over here.
This hits home for me because I'm from Iowa.
Oh yeah.
I'm also from Harrison County.
Oh my gosh.
And I also grew up on a family farm, but we rent that farm out.
Yep.
So this is like arguably too close to home. But I want to know what the average age of the farmers that you talk with in focus groups, and then why you think, likely because it's older, the younger generation this is me, right? We are going into agriculture, but not going back onto generational farms. We're not going into farming.
Yeah.
And do you think that impacts or skews the age to older farmers because the new generation below them don't want to farm anymore?
Yeah, I could see that being an issue. There was a lot of concern about farm succession and who was going to get the farm at some point, and were they going to pass it down to somebody, or did they even have somebody to pass it down to, right? And that was very concerning, very emotional for a lot of people, as far as like, I'm taking care of this land and I want to pass it on, but none of my kids want to, that kind of a thing. There were a lot of older people who talked in the focus groups, but most of the focus groups I did were actually intergenerational, which is really interesting, where it would often be a father and son who came to the focus group together. And it was really interesting to see the difference in perspective among the generations. Because on the one hand, you had the younger people who were like maybe more willing to innovate in some ways and more willing to take risks. But at the same time, they grew up in a world where all you used was glyphosate, right? The older guys in the focus groups did not. They remember a time when you did other things. They remembered a time where it was more integrated. And they were like, if I had to, I could go get the cultivator out of the barn and I could manage this. And I don't know that my son would know how to do that. So it was really interesting in terms of like the younger people maybe being more risk-taking and more innovative, but also just not having that experiential familiarity with doing anything other than just straight glyphosate for weed management. Yeah.
Did you find, great talk, by the way, did you find there was a certain openness or interest in incentivizing adoption of these techniques? And more importantly, was in your experience, have you found it to actually be impactful?
As far as like monetary incentives?
In terms of monetary incentive, tax incentive, basically things that affect the bottom line, because oftentimes a major barrier, and Northworthy talks about this in his paper, is literally the focus on short-term economic restraints and benefits compared to the long-term necessities.
Yeah, and so part of what I've found is like people tell me that's the issue a lot of the time. I don't know if it's actually the issue. It's definitely part of it. But for instance, with our economic analysis, our team spent like literally years working with this community to make this economic analysis and forecasting tool that was focused on getting them from thinking short-term to long-term and showing the long-term impacts of different weed management decisions. And the team worked really hard on developing this thing. The growers we worked with said they really wanted it. This was the tool they needed. We finally got there. We developed it. We released it. Nobody is using it. Nobody is using it. So I think there's definitely a strong economics part here as far as like incentives and what people will do, but there's something else going on, right? It's not just about the money. It's also about how much time do I spend on the farm and do I get to go fishing on the weekends? It's also about like soil quality. It's about all these different things. It's about ideologies and individualism. And I think to just say that it's an economic problem, yeah, a lot of people say that. But then when I dig deeper, there's other things going on, which is really interesting to me. But there is definitely a movement to do more monetary incentives for effectively managing pest resistance. And that's one of the things we're pursuing with NRCS as far as like a conservation enhancement. But one of my questions is also, do incentives actually change people's minds? Because there's some research out there that indicates that they do the conservation practice while you're paying them, but as soon as the payments stop, the conservation practice stops. So it's not changing that underlying worldview, right? It's not changing their thought process about why they do conservation. So yeah, complicated relationship to incentives for sure. Yeah.
You mentioned your survey instrument on the ideology.
Yeah.
Is that difficult to develop, the techno optimism versus?
Well, so we developed the survey directly out of the focus groups. So a lot of what I was doing was like taking statements basically from growers and then measuring grower agreement with those statements from the focus groups. So that's part of how I designed that. And then some of the ideology, individualism stuff, I also looked at other surveys that had done similar things in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, you might.
Oh yeah, sorry.
I presume we can hear Lynn if she asks her question.
Can I? She's.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Loved your presentation. Looking forward to meeting with you later today. I have a question about techno optimism and actually novel technology, because I'm really heavily involved in looking at electrical weeding, targeted vision guided spraying, vision cultivation, robotic technology. And I guess if you're exploring this area, and if your research is delving into that, and if there is a sense of optimism associated with, kind of, the coming of robots and, digital ag and artificial intelligence, or if there's, again, some sort of hesitation, whereas they have techno-optimism for the chemistry, but, are not as optimistic, or maybe are realistic about the current status of technology, maybe optimistic for the future. I really am very interested in what you think about that.
Absolutely. Great question. So it was a lot of techno-optimism towards herbicides. One of the things that me and my team were really interested in is, could we use the language and the ideology of techno-optimism in our favor to promote more integrated weed management practices, to promote biological or mechanical weed management practices, as the next new technology is not a herbicide, it's something else, right? But also making sure to not be like, it's one thing. So maybe the next technological innovation is a suite of technological practices, as opposed to one technological practice. I think that's a really powerful way to frame it, because the issue with ideologies like this is you can't just change them, right? You can't just go in and be like, you should not be, have hope in technology anymore. That's not going to work. That's never going to work. These are deep-seated worldviews. So we've partly transitioned into looking at, how can we employ these ideologies that people already have to encourage these more integrated practices? So changing the language, changing the conversation around herbicides as the next technology into maybe other kinds of technology are the next technology. And maybe it's rotating those kinds of technology, and that's where the techno-optimism is helping. So I think that that's absolutely a valid way of seeing it. And definitely some farmers were really interested in things like the Harrington seed destructor, which is like a mechanical destruction of seeds that's really taken off in Australia. And even back in like 2014, 2015, when I was doing these focus groups, people were already talking about that. And I've seen that grow in interest as well. So absolutely, great point.
Anything else on?
One here.
I remember being in Iowa several years ago.
Yeah.
They were promoting riparian strips.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really successful.
Yeah.
And as I recall, the reason wasn't so much, well, it prevents, soil running into the water and so forth, but it improved hunting. And I think they partnered with the state to maybe stock pheasants, all that seeded adoption to a really high level. So I guess I was just sort of thinking, are there sort of secondary incentives besides the financial ones that Leah mentioned that would?
Yeah, that's a great question.
In a way we're not thinking about indirectly.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know that some of the work being done at Iowa State is connected to projects on monarch butterfly conservation, and how that's related to pesticides and pesticide use. And if we can reduce pesticide use, that might help with monarch butterflies. And it's really interesting because it kind of goes back to this idea of good farming and what is a good farm. And it's like, what's a pest and those kind of things. But people have actually been increasingly proud of having more butterflies on their farm and seeing having more monarchs and more species of butterflies on their farm as an indicator that they are good farmers. And so I think that conversation is starting to shift, right? Where there's like news that some butterfly that hadn't been seen in Iowa in like 50 years appeared on this guy's farm. And that guy was really proud. And he was like, yeah, the butterfly's on my farm. Like, I must be doing really well. So I think another thing with transitioning some of these ideologies about how we use herbicides and how we use different kinds of pest resistance has to do with signals of good farming and what people take good farming to mean. And does that mean a completely clean field with absolutely nothing in it and like no animals, no weeds, no nothing? Or does it mean supporting biodiversity in some ways? And how can we make that visible? How can we make it so it's not just yield competitions, right? It's not just bushels per acre, but it's what does the biodiversity on your farm look like? And can that be a valuable measure of being a good farmer? Yeah, I think that's a good conversation to have. I don't know if it's related to pheasant hunting, but it has potential. Yeah.
So you mentioned an example in Arkansas where there was a successful program because of an extension agent there who's then retired. Are there, any sort of like trainings or like tools that you would encourage existing or future extension educators to start learning about and using to try to be able to reach these communities that seem to be, as you pointed out, more individualized and more polarized over time?
That's tough. I would say as far as like pesticide resistance and herbicide resistance, not really yet. Iowa State, the model for community change that I showed, if you go on Iowa State Extension's website, you can download that for free. And I think that's a great starting point. That was developed by rural sociologist Paul Lastly, who was on this project before me, before he retired. And it really outlines like how communities change and how to talk to communities, but also what questions you should be asking them. And so that's a really useful tool. But part of the issue is that we don't have enough sociologists working on this problem. Something that happens to me a lot is I get invited to do a ton of talks to people in extension offices, to weed scientists, to entomologists, right? And I get more than I can possibly actually attend. And I'm one of the only people in sociology doing this research. And increasingly, rural sociology programs are getting cut. So there used to be one at Washington State, it was cut. There used to be one, and they're shifting, and it's just not as supported at universities as it used to be. And I think this is a real problem. I think it's a problem in that we need rural sociologists, but I also think it's an issue of educating people in other fields about what the social sciences are and how to use them and how to collaborate effectively with social scientists so that we can produce more training materials like this and have people that are social science smart, right? No matter what field they're in, so that they can adopt those principles into their own work. So that's something I'm really excited about pursuing into the future.
Okay. Doesn't seem like anything else.
I don't see any other hands up.
Well, good.
Thank you. It was great talking to y'all. I'll hang around. I'm getting lunch pretty soon, but I'm here for any more questions that you have.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.